The woman was already screaming when the first patrol car turned the corner, and every instinct in my body told me this night was about to become a story people would argue about online. She pointed straight at me, shouting that I was trespassing, threatening, and refusing to comply, even though I was standing completely still in front of my own building. Neighbors peeked through blinds, phones appeared in hands, and that familiar tension spread across the street like electricity. She kept yelling that she wanted me arrested immediately, citing laws she clearly half remembered, demanding the officers do their job. I stayed silent, not out of fear, but because experience had taught me that moments like this have their own momentum. When the cruisers stopped, the officers stepped out, took one look at the scene, and did something that made the shouting stop cold. They stood straight, adjusted their posture, and raised their hands in a formal salute. The woman froze, her mouth still open, words stranded halfway out. I returned the salute, calmly, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Confusion rippled through the small crowd, and I could feel the weight of every eye on me. The woman stammered, demanding to know what was going on, insisting there had been a mistake. One officer asked her politely to lower her voice, while the other addressed me by name. That was the moment the balance of power shifted completely. I hadn't said a word yet, but the truth was already standing there in plain sight. The woman backed up a step, eyes darting between the badges and my face. She realized, too late, that the authority she had tried to weaponize wasn't on her side. And as the officers began to explain who I was and why they were there, I knew this confrontation was only beginning. What happened next would expose exactly how dangerous confidence without understanding can be. I had seen situations like this unfold before, where assumption dressed itself up as certainty and demanded obedience. The difference tonight was that she had chosen the wrong target at the wrong time. The officers asked her for specifics, questions simple enough to answer if facts actually existed. She struggled, repeating feelings instead of actions, suspicion instead of evidence. Every answer unraveled the story she had rehearsed, and with each pause, the reality of her mistake grew heavier. I watched, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet awareness of where this was headed. The law doesn't bend for volume or outrage, and it certainly doesn't reward arrogance. As the explanation continued, the crowd leaned in, realizing they were witnessing something rare, a reversal of expectation. By the time the woman finally fell silent, the lesson. The officer closest to her spoke calmly, asking her to explain exactly what crime she believed I had committed. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, then pointed at me again, saying I was refusing to leave and acting suspicious. The officer nodded and asked a second question, slower this time, asking whose property we were standing on. She hesitated, then claimed it was public space. That's when I finally spoke, my voice steady, explaining that the building behind me wasn't just private property, but one I was officially responsible for. The officer confirmed it with a quick glance at his partner, who was already checking records on his tablet. The woman's face tightened as her certainty began to slip. She tried to regain control by raising her voice, insisting that anyone could say anything, that titles didn't matter, that laws were laws. The officer disagreed politely, explaining that facts always come before volume. He asked her again what specific action justified arrest. She stumbled through her words, circling back to how uncomfortable she felt and how people like me shouldn't just stand around. That phrase hung in the air longer than she expected. The officer's tone shifted, not angry, but firm. He explained that discomfort is not a crime and that calling for an arrest requires probable cause, not personal fear. I could see realization creeping in around her eyes, the moment when confidence starts to crack. The second officer stepped forward and addressed the small crowd, assuring them everything was under control. Phones stayed raised anyway. The woman noticed. Her shoulders stiffened as she realized this wasn't going to end with me in handcuffs. She demanded to know why they had saluted me, accusing them of favoritism. That was when the officer explained my role, briefly and professionally, and why respect was part of protocol. Her mouth opened, then closed, as if her thoughts couldn't keep up with the information. She shook her head, muttering that this was unbelievable, that no one had told her. The officer replied that ignorance of someone's position doesn't create authority over them. He then informed her that making a false or exaggerated report could have consequences of its own. That word changed everything. Her posture collapsed slightly, bravado draining away. She asked if she was in trouble. The officer said they were still determining that. He requested her identification. She handed it over reluctantly, hands shaking just enough to notice. I stood quietly, watching the situation turn from accusation to accountability. The night air felt heavier now, not with tension, but with consequence. This was no longer about me. It was about what happens when someone demands power without understanding how it works. And the officers were not finished yet. While one officer ran her information, the other continued asking questions, this time documenting her answers word for word. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. What had started as her complaint was now an inquiry into her actions. She tried to soften her tone, laughing nervously, saying she might have overreacted a little. The officer acknowledged that people get scared, then explained that fear does not excuse calling for someone's arrest without cause. Each sentence was calm, practiced, and precise, the kind of language used when patience is extended but limits are approaching. She glanced at me repeatedly, as if expecting me to intervene on her behalf. I didn't. This wasn't my process anymore. The officer returned with her ID, handed it back, and told her the call would be marked as unfounded. That word landed harder than any accusation. She immediately protested, insisting she had done nothing wrong, that she was only trying to protect the neighborhood. The officer replied that protection requires accuracy, and accuracy requires facts. He explained that her statements didn't match observable behavior, and that escalation without evidence creates risk for everyone involved. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling as people realized the outcome wasn't what they had expected. One neighbor quietly lowered their phone. Another shook their head. The woman noticed, her cheeks flushing as embarrassment replaced anger. She demanded to know what would happen next. The officer told her plainly, "Tonight ends with a warning, but the call would remain on record. Any similar misuse in the future could lead to charges." Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. She nodded quickly, agreeing, apologizing to the officers but never looking at me. That omission said more than words. The officer asked if she understood. She said yes, too fast. He reminded her that emergency services are not tools for personal enforcement, then turned to me and asked if I wished to add anything. I declined. There was nothing left to say. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them thanked me for remaining calm, then addressed the crowd, explaining that no laws had been broken and that everyone was free to go. Slowly, people dispersed, the drama dissolving back into routine. The woman stood alone for a moment, then walked away without another word. The street felt different once she was gone, quieter, almost relieved. I took a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Encounters like this linger, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. One assumption, one louder demand, one less patient officer, and the outcome could have changed completely. That's the part people don't see. As I headed inside, I reflected on how easily authority is misunderstood, how often respect is demanded instead of earned. Tonight had ended without handcuffs, without headlines, but with a lesson that would stay with everyone who witnessed it. And although it felt finished, I knew from experience that stories like this rarely end where people think they do. The real consequences often arrive later, quietly, when no one is watching. 2 days later, I thought the incident was behind me, just another uncomfortable moment filed away with dozens of others from a long career. Then my phone rang early in the morning, the kind of call that tells you a report has grown legs. A supervisor wanted clarification, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because the woman had followed up with a complaint. She claimed the officers were biased, that they had embarrassed her, that I had used my position to intimidate her. None of it surprised me. When authority fails to deliver the outcome someone expects, the narrative often changes. I agreed to provide a written statement, knowing documentation is where truth either stands or collapses. I laid out the timeline carefully, minute by minute, sticking to facts, not feelings. Where I stood. What she said. What the officers asked. What was observed. No commentary. No judgment. Just sequence. Later that day, I was asked to review the body camera footage alongside a senior officer. We watched it together, silently, letting the video speak for itself. Her volume. My stillness. The salute. The questions. The warning. Every detail aligned with the report. The senior officer nodded, closed the file, and said that should be the end of it. For me, it was. For her, it wasn't. That evening, I saw a post circulating in a local group, vague but pointed, describing how powerful people get special treatment and how regular citizens are silenced. Comments piled up fast, some sympathetic, others skeptical. A few people who had been there corrected the record, calmly, accurately. The post lost momentum. Truth tends to do that when witnesses exist. I logged off and moved on. The next morning, an email arrived confirming the complaint had been reviewed and dismissed. The officers were cleared. No further action required. It should have felt satisfying. It didn't. Instead, it felt familiar. This is the quiet part of authority most people never see, where systems absorb accusations and release facts. Later that week, I ran into one of the officers at a coffee shop. He thanked me, not for the salute, but for not escalating the situation when it could have gone sideways. He said restraint made his job easier. That stuck with me. People often think power is loud, visible, dramatic. In reality, it's measured by what you choose not to do. The woman never contacted me directly. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. And she didn't need to. The system had already done its work. As I walked back to my car, I realized the real story wasn't about her demand or the salute. It was about how quickly a moment can turn when assumptions meet structure. And just when I thought the lesson had settled, something else happened that proved this wasn't an isolated incident at all. A week after everything supposedly ended, I was asked to sit in on a briefing for new officers, a routine request I usually declined. This time, they wanted to discuss a recent community interaction as a learning example. I knew immediately which one. The room was small, chairs in rows, coffee cups lining the back table. When the footage played, no names were mentioned, but everyone recognized the moment. The shouting. The pointing. The demand for arrest. The salute. The instructor paused the video at key moments, asking the trainees what they noticed first. Some said body language. Others said tone. One said the most important moment was the pause before anyone spoke. That answer mattered. The instructor explained how quickly situations escalate when officers react to volume instead of facts. He emphasized that authority doesn't begin with commands, but with assessment. I watched the faces in the room as understanding settled in. These weren't people hungry for power. They were people learning how not to misuse it. After the briefing, a trainee approached me privately and asked what it felt like to be on the other side of a false accusation. I told him the truth. It's frustrating, but it's also revealing. It shows you how fragile trust can be and how important process really is. Later that day, I received a message from a neighborhood association requesting a meeting about safety concerns. The wording was careful, but the implication was clear. Fear was circulating again, detached from facts. I agreed to attend. At the meeting, residents spoke about suspicious behavior, unfamiliar faces, discomfort. I listened, then asked them to define what suspicious actually meant. Silence followed. I explained that safety improves with communication, lighting, awareness, not assumptions, and emergency calls. Some nodded. Others resisted. Change is uneven like that. Afterward, one resident thanked me for saying what others were afraid to hear. That's when I understood the real reach of that night. It wasn't about one woman or one salute. It was about how easily fear spreads when left unchecked, and how rarely it's challenged calmly. Over the next few days, similar calls dropped in frequency. Dispatchers noticed. Officers noticed. Something small had shifted. Not because of discipline or embarrassment, but because clarity had been introduced. People had seen how quickly power can reverse when misused. One evening, as I locked up my office, I thought about how close that night came to ending differently. If I'd argued. If the officers had rushed. If the crowd had interfered. None of that happened. And because of that restraint, a moment of conflict became a lesson instead of a headline. Still, I knew better than to think the story was finished. Misunderstandings have a way of returning, often when you least expect them. And the next one would test whether the lesson had truly been learned. The next test arrived quietly, without shouting or cameras, which is how real pressure usually shows up. A late-night call came from the same block, a different voice reporting someone hanging around cars. 2 officers responded, one a veteran, one fresh from training. I listened later as the radio traffic stayed calm, procedural, almost boring. On scene, they observed first, lights low, distance kept. The person leaned against a fence, headphones in, waiting for a ride. No approach, no commands. The caller hovered nearby, narrating worry, pushing urgency. The veteran officer asked the trainee what facts supported a stop. The trainee answered carefully, none yet. They waited. A ride-sharer pulled up. The person left. The officers cleared. No contact made. No escalation earned. The caller was unhappy. She demanded names, demanded action, demanded reassurance that something would be done. The veteran explained that observation had resolved the concern and that no law supported intervention. He offered alternatives, better lighting, a non-emergency line, community watch meetings. The caller scoffed, but the explanation stood. Back at the station, the trainee asked if they should have at least questioned the person. The veteran said restraint is an action, not an absence, and that doing less can protect more. I smiled when I heard that. Lessons had stuck. The next morning, a short memo circulated, praising the handling and highlighting the decision points. No one was singled out. The focus stayed on process. Dispatch added a prompt to clarify behavior before coding urgency. Small adjustments, cumulative effect. Over the following weeks, similar calls tapered. When they did come, they resolved faster, calmer. People learned the language of facts. I received a brief message from the woman who had demanded my arrest weeks earlier. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. She said she'd attended a meeting, learned what to say and what not to say, and realized how quickly assumptions travel. I replied with one sentence, learning is the outcome we hope for. That night, I drove past the building again, noticing how ordinary it looked. Ordinary is success. When authority is used correctly, nothing dramatic happens. Lives continue uninterrupted. That's the goal, even if it never trends. The system doesn't need gratitude. It needs discipline. And discipline had begun to take root, one quiet call at a time. Quiet progress rarely announces itself, but it compounds. Policies become habits, habits become culture, and culture protects strangers without applause. I don't need salutes to know it's working. I need pauses, questions, and refusals to rush. That night proved the difference. Not every call needs force. Some need patience, clarity, and the courage to do nothing. Those choices keep streets calm, officers steady, and communities safer long after sirens fade away for everyone involved. A month later, the story resurfaced in a way I didn't expect. Not as a complaint or a call, but as a question. I was invited to speak at a small civic forum about community safety, the kind that usually draws a handful of retirees and a few board officials. That night, the room was full. Word had traveled, stripped of names but heavy with curiosity. People wanted to understand what authority actually looks like when it works. I began by telling them this wasn't about heroes or villains. It was about moments. Small choices made under pressure. I described how quickly fear can turn into certainty, and how certainty can turn into demands. Heads nodded. Some looked uncomfortable. That was okay. Growth usually is. During the open discussion, someone asked the question everyone was circling: why do police sometimes seem to side with one person immediately? I answered honestly. They don't side with people. They side with facts, training, and structure. When those align, outcomes feel fair. When they don't, they feel personal. Another person asked how regular citizens could protect themselves without overreacting. I explained the difference between awareness and suspicion, between reporting behavior and projecting motives. The woman from that night was there, sitting near the back. She didn't speak. She listened. After the forum ended, people lingered, talking in clusters. A few thanked me. A few challenged me. Both mattered. As I gathered my notes, the woman approached. This time, there was no anger in her posture. She told me she'd replayed that night in her head more times than she liked to admit. She said she realized she hadn't wanted safety. She'd wanted control. Saying it out loud seemed to surprise her. I didn't respond immediately. Then I told her that recognition is where accountability begins, and most people never reach it. She nodded, eyes down, and said she hoped she'd handle things differently next time. I told her I hoped the same, not just for her, but for everyone. Driving home, I thought about how rarely we see the aftershocks of these moments. We focus on the confrontation, not the reflection that follows. But reflection is where change lives. The salute that night had gone viral in whispers, but the real impact was quieter, fewer calls, better questions, calmer responses. None of that fits neatly into a headline. The next morning, I received confirmation that the department was expanding community education sessions citywide. Not because of me, but because the need had revealed itself. That's how progress usually works. It doesn't arrive announced. It's invited by discomfort and sustained by humility. And just when it felt like the lesson had fully settled, one final encounter brought everything full circle. The final encounter happened on an afternoon so ordinary it almost felt scripted by irony. I was leaving a local grocery store, bags in hand, mind on nothing more than dinner, when I heard raised voices near the parking lot. Not shouting, but sharp enough to pull attention. A man stood beside his car, frustrated, while a store employee spoke into a radio, glancing his way. A small crowd had begun to form again, that familiar shape of curiosity and assumption. I paused at a distance, not intervening, just observing. The employee accused the man of loitering and making customers uneasy. The man insisted he was waiting for his wife. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived. Different officers this time. New faces. I felt that old tension, wondering which version of the lesson would show up. The officers approached calmly, asked both parties to explain. The employee spoke first, confident, repeating words like suspicious and policy. The officer nodded, then asked for specific behavior that violated store rules or the law. The employee hesitated. The man explained his situation clearly, even pulling out his phone to show a message from his wife. One officer turned to the other and quietly confirmed there was no cause for detention. They thanked the man for his patience and explained the situation to the employee, reminding him that suspicion alone isn't a rule violation. The crowd dispersed quickly this time. No phones raised. No drama fed. I smiled to myself, not because of recognition, but because of restraint. As I walked past, one officer caught my eye and nodded, not a salute, just acknowledgement. That felt right. The employee looked embarrassed but not angry. He listened. He learned. Later, as I loaded my car, I thought about how different this moment felt from the first. No shouting. No demands. No humiliation. Just correction. That's the version of authority worth trusting. On the drive home, I realized this was the real ending, not a confrontation, but a quiet application of everything learned since that first night. The woman, the forum, the trainees, the memos, all of it had led here. A situation that could have escalated didn't, because people paused. They asked better questions. They accepted answers. That's how safety actually grows, not through fear, but through understanding. I unpacked my groceries and laughed softly at how uneventful the afternoon had been. Uneventful is the goal. If no one remembers this moment tomorrow, that means it worked. And as I set the bags down, I knew the story was nearly finished. There was only one thing left to reflect on, one final truth that tied every moment together and deserved to be said clearly. I thought about that first night again, not with tension, but with clarity. The yelling, the pointing, the demand for my arrest had felt dramatic in the moment, but drama was never the point. The point was what followed when volume met structure and assumption met discipline. Authority, real authority, doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to win arguments or prove dominance. It just needs to be applied correctly. Standing there now, weeks later, everything felt quieter, not just on the street, but inside the system itself. Calls were handled differently. Conversations sounded calmer. Questions came before commands. That shift didn't happen because someone was embarrassed or corrected publicly. It happened because people saw what restraint looks like in practice. The salute that stunned her that night wasn't about me. It was about respect for process, for role, for order. Too often, people think respect is demanded upward. In truth, it flows both ways or it collapses entirely. I've learned over the years that the most powerful moments rarely feel powerful at all. They feel ordinary. An officer choosing to wait. A dispatcher asking one more question. A citizen realizing that fear doesn't equal danger. These are the moments that prevent harm before it starts. The woman who demanded my arrest became a footnote, not because she was punished, but because she learned. The officers became examples, not because they asserted power, but because they didn't need to. And the community became safer, not through force, but through understanding. That's the part no one puts in the comments. If there's a lesson here, it isn't that I was saluted or that someone was wrong. It's that systems work when people trust them enough to slow down. Laws exist to protect, not to be weaponized. Authority exists to serve, not to intimidate. And respect is earned through consistency, not volume. I don't tell this story to feel important. I tell it because it could happen anywhere, to anyone, and the outcome depends entirely on how we choose to act in the moment. The next time someone demands power without understanding it, I hope there's an officer who pauses. The next time fear feels urgent, I hope someone asks for facts. And the next time authority shows up, I hope it does so quietly, confidently, and correctly. That night ended without handcuffs, without arrests, without headlines. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because the best outcome is the one where nothing bad happens at all. The street stays quiet. People go home. Lessons stick. That's how trust is built, one uneventful moment at a time. And if this story changes even one reaction, one call, one assumption, then it's done its job. Sometimes the strongest response isn't force. It's knowing when force isn't needed.